prepared some remarks from the perspective of the outlier here in the panel, but from the perspective of someone who represents a discipline for whom Foucault has also been very important. Stephanie did such a nice job of summarizing some of the main points in Colin's book that I feel like I don't have to do that, so bear with me while I work through just a few of my notes, and I'll certainly try to keep this brief. So this was interesting for me. The way that Colin sets up his book is to say, all right, there's this majority strand of reception of Foucault, and that's what I'm going to position my reading of Foucault against. And Stephanie has really told us how Colin does that. Unfortunately, the majority strand reception of Foucault happens to be the one that comes out of literary and cultural studies, which I appreciated. We are described as a, let's see, I'll just read you the quote from page 8. The majority strand of reception reads Foucault's enormous interpretive apparatus through that loose amalgam of thought arising out of literary criticism and cultural studies that is often referred to today under the deceptively simple banner of theory. In fact, this is absolutely right. We own Foucault. You guys are just bored. No. But it's certainly true that I was introduced to Foucault in graduate school, and Foucault primarily as a fabricator. I don't mean that in the negative sense, but as a fabricator of concepts that could then be taken up by other scholars and applied. So of course, Colin's argument is that we've misunderstood Foucault if we think of him as doing theory rather than conducting inquiry. And that's the problem that Colin aims to address in his book, and he addresses it very well. Of course, my question, the main question that I had in mind as I read through it is why and for whom is this a problem? And I think actually Stephanie has already gone some ways towards answering some of my questions. An anecdote, though, I should say that Foucault was not taken up unproblematically even in English departments. An anecdote from my own graduate school experience is that one of my first seminars with a very established professor of American literature who had us reading, not really theory, but had us reading a whole book of literary criticism and an entire classic American novel a week. So 1 week was like Moby Dick. And another book, it was a bit, I think that was part of the point. It was like, welcome to graduate school. And one student referred to Discipline and Punish in class, and the professor just went off on a diatribe against Foucault, basically telling us that Foucault is useless, that he had a toothless view of history. It's just materialism for Marxists who don't want to be Marxist. And nobody contradicts him after class, but there must have been some kind of look on my face, because afterwards one of the more senior graduate students approached me and said, no, you really do need to know about Foucault, which I already knew about, but I must have looked like I had no idea what was going on, and perhaps I didn't. I remember she made me a photocopy of some of the opening pages of the Foucault collection that was the standard one at the time, before all the work on ethics came out. So there was definitely a sense in graduate school in English, at least, and for me this is the later 1990s, that Foucault was someone for younger faculty and graduate students get really excited about, to deploy or to utilize in our work. Especially for those of us working in the long 18th century, where Foucault historically locates a number of the shifts that for him, herald the onset of modernity. But from Colin's perspective, the influence of this version of Foucault has been too strong, and I think so. He provides a really important and provocative, especially for someone coming from my position, counter vision of Foucault. One who's more of a philosophical social scientist. That's Colin's phrase, rather than a theorist. And so I just briefly like to say talk about a couple of the benefits that I found to adopting Colin's perspective, and then one or two concerns. So Stephanie, I think, already did a wonderful job of showing how by taking problematization as the master key of Foucault's thought, Colin finds a way through and around the problem of these sort of supposedly discrete phases in Foucault's career, which often look somewhat contradictory. I will mention, I thought it was really helpful the way that Colin distinguishes between two meanings of problematization in Foucault's work. It is a verb to problematize, and I think that's the one that we're most familiar with in literary studies, but it's also a noun, says Colin, meaning to delineate a problematization as an object of inquiry. To identify, say, a problematization of illness in a particular poet's oeuvre. And Colin notes that Foucault's not alone here. Someone like Louis Althusser and his concept of the problematic was sort of better known, but of course then you have all the Marxism coming back, which might be one reason to think more carefully about Foucault's version of problematization. Another really important point for me about what Colin's book does so well and so helpfully is argues for connections between Foucault and some other philosophers, theorists, to whom he is too often opposed rather than allied, at least from where I stand. The examples, and then other connections that I think I took for granted, and Colin problematizes them. Let's see. Nietzsche and Derrida, those were two figures who, in my graduate school training, sort of were shown to naturally go with Foucault. But Colin makes strong cases that unsettle the obviousness of those. I won't go into the details, but I'd encourage you to look at them. Colin has some great stuff to say about Nietzsche's critics and Nietzsche's defenders, and the various versions, especially American versions of Nietzsche that emerged. With regard to Derrida, I have for a while now begun to suspect that maybe they were always more of an odd couple than they appeared, but again I think there were institutional and historical reasons why they were both absorbed simultaneously more or less by Anglo-American English departments. And so the notion of French theory, right, which was sort of hegemonic in the latter decades of the 20th century, had maybe better reasons institutionally than it actually had conceptually. Because Foucaultian problematization differs profoundly from Freudian deconstruction in some important ways, and I think Colin's excellent at showing that. Some of the theoretical alliances that Colin draws out that were revelatory, I think, for one with Kant. Again, in my graduate school training, Kant and Foucault occupied sort of opposite ends of the ring to a large degree, and we all know who would have won in an arm wrestle there. Anyways, I actually realize I don't know. But the point is that whereas they were seen for me as pursuing rather different intellectual projects, especially with the historical versus the transcendental, I mean, there is Foucault's essay, What is Enlightenment? And so it was clear to some degree that was seen the way that I sort of took it up as a kind of one-off. And Colin does a really good job of showing how Foucault is taking up the Kantian project of the critique of the limits of knowledge in a way that had never been so clear to me before. And then with Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, a friendship that's well known between the two of them. But again, in graduate school, for me, they were presented as sort of operating or moving along relatively different tracks. Foucault, the theorist of pleasure, Deleuze, the theorist of desire, Foucault, the theorist of the disciplinary society, Deleuze, the theorist of the society of control. I still think these are useful distinctions. And so one of the places where I've asked Colin to maybe say a bit more has to do with the complete absence of psychoanalysis, which of course Foucault was opposed to, but it seemed to me that one of the great divisions between Deleuze and Foucault had to do with Deleuze's much greater engagement with that. But Colin, on the other hand, shows very well that Foucault learned a lot from Deleuze's early work, especially his work on Bergson, and the way he frames the importance of asking the right questions. Not asking questions that seem like they're going to have answers, but learning to produce new questions. All right, finally, I'll briefly end by outlining just a few further questions that I have for Colin, and he is aware of these. I did have some questions for Colin about his critique of Agamben's reading of Foucault. I found that to be a very useful reading of Foucault, but it is a concept-heavy reading of Foucault. Agamben treats Foucault as somebody who creates a series of sort of conceptual tools to be deployed. I still kind of like that model. and so more generally, of course, the question that I have for Colin is, can't I have my Foucault the concept maker and allow for Foucault the problematizer as well? Also, of course, the last thing I'll just mention, because I think Colin may take this up. Of course, there is the famous little diatribe by Jean Baudrillard called "Forget Foucault," who doesn't love a little alliteration. It's actually, to a certain degree, it's Bruno Latour who has mounted a more recent argument, not against Foucault specifically, but against critique in general. Right? And Latour has asked us, look, has critique run out of steam? That's in fact the title of the well-known critical inquiry essay that he wrote, almost a decade ago now, published a decade ago, in which he argues that the basic methods of critique are, one, increasingly unsuited to tracking today's network-based social assemblages, and two, too easily, and this is maybe the more cutting critique, too easily co-opted by vested and conservative interests. That is to say, now that we've learned to question everything, the powers that be have learned to turn that around and say, great, let's question everything, including the science behind climate change, right? That's one of the most sort of famous examples now of using that hermeneutics of suspicion against any possibility of social change. But I'll end by saying that the Foucault that Colin described in his book, though, very frequently sounds more like Latour than I was used to hearing. For instance, and I'll end with this, his description of how Foucault sees the problem with modernity as a problem of attempting to purify rationality and freedom, such that they are unmixed with madness and power. That's Foucault's reading of part of the problem of modernity, attempting to purify rationality and freedom from madness and power. That sounds a lot like the Latour of "We Have Never Been Modern." He sees the problem with us moderns as our obsession with trying to purify the natural and the cultural and all the destructive impulses that have come from there. Thank you.